So the early church was a mixture of both Jewish and Gentile believers in Jesus, but with Gentile believers quickly outnumbering the Jewish believers. And this brings us to the stage in history when the early church and Judaism undergo what is historically known as the parting of ways. In other words, a great divorce, perhaps even the greatest in history. In this period, many early Christians intentionally tried to distinguish themselves from Jewish people, from Jewish traditions, and from the calendar. And oftentimes this happened for political expediency. To be associated with a Jewish movement at that time would often invite persecution of Rome. Later on, however, political reasoning changed into a theological rationale. In other words, if it was associated with Judaism, it was considered heretical. Well, Passover became a central controversy in all of this, with some believers wanting to observe Passover according to the biblical and Jewish calendar, namely on the 14th of Nisan, while others, the majority in fact, who also happened to have the support of most of the church fathers, they wanted to disassociate from the Jewish calendar by changing it to a stable yearly Sunday on the Julian calendar. By 325 CE, under Constantine's order at the Council of Nicaea, it became henceforth forbidden to celebrate Easter, even with specifically Christian rituals, at the same time as the Jewish Passover. The church adopted a standardized date for the observance of Easter at the command of the emperor, who was likely trying to consolidate his power throughout the empire, especially by eliminating Jewish traditions in church practice. So this decision at the Council of Nicaea, it didn't just discourage Jewish customs, as was the case in the past, but it actually considered all Jewish expressions, such as the keeping of the Jewish Passover, heretical. Final answer. At this crucial point in history, Jewish believers in Jesus were not only marginalized, but Christianity really detached and separated from its Jewish heritage and foundation. And we see all the cracks in the Jewish-Christian relationship finally collapse in 325 to form an insurmountable chasm, as one author puts it, as well as a hostile antagonism toward Jewish people that only worsened and tragically endures even to our day. Before 325, there were many Jewish believers in Jesus, Jewish and Gentile alike. Groups such as the Ebionites, the Nazarenes, and the Audians, and others, who kept Passover on the 14th day of Nisan, along with the traditional Jewish community, because they knew the fulfillment of the lamb that was sacrificed over Passover, Jesus. They had no problem pairing the deliverance from Egypt with their deliverance from sin through Yeshua. There was no problem memorializing Jesus, the bread of life, who was without leaven, without sin, with the feast of unleavened bread. These groups, however, were discredited by the church fathers as heretical. The great church father Origen testifies against their observance of Passover, saying that Jesus came to those who were under the law in order to lead them away from the law. His attitude was unfortunately shared by many other important church fathers whose influence shaped most of the church, people like Tertullian, Hippolytus, Eusebius, and Epiphanius, all of whom condemned Jewish believers in Jesus as heretical for still keeping Jewish customs. You actually see this attitude very early on with Ignatius of Antioch. He writes in his letter to the church of Philippi, "If anyone celebrates the Passover along with the Jews, or receives the emblems of their feast, he is a partaker with those that killed the Lord and his apostles." Okay, let's process some of this. I believe that the church fathers did a lot of these things out of good intentions, extreme and misinformed, but nevertheless good intentions. What was, in fact, of utmost importance to the church fathers was the need to preserve the spirit of the gospel of grace and not of works. Namely, that justification before God comes not as a result of keeping the law, which all have fallen short of and broken, but by faith in Yeshua's work and perfect keeping of the Torah on all our behalf. And that is not only a good intention, but in fact a necessary one. But we all know how irrelevant even good intentions are when they still drive us to act out of fear. And we all know how easy it is to let fear drive us from one wrong extreme to the opposite wrong extreme. And it seems like most of the church fathers who were not themselves Jewish rejected Jewish customs because they were afraid it got too close to the Judaizing that the Apostle Paul passionately spoke out against. Yet, still, in this fearful zeal, they took the church to the opposite and dangerous extreme, de-Judaizing, the cutting off of all Jewish associations and expressions, even when it was biblical. And well, this simply begs the question, in their zeal to cut off the Jewishness, how much of the biblical was also cut off along with it? How much of good biblical things like Passover, which could have helped give mental and spiritual categories and a context to Gentile believers to help them understand the atonement that this Jewish Messiah offers the world, and these are categories that were in fact preserved by the early Jewish believers, but that unfortunately was lost upon future generations in the church. So, despite good intentions, it is necessary to acknowledge that even such good intentions caused a lot of damage to the church, and it cheated future Christians, even today, of all that is to be gained from the Jewish heritage and roots of the faith. And that's not even all. It gets worse, because in fact, this anti-Judaism turns quickly into anti-Semitism and superstitions and the spilling of lots and lots of innocent Jewish blood throughout the centuries. That, however, is a subject to be studied in its own right. And so if you wanted to actually know more about this tragic piece of history, definitely check out Michael Brown's book, Our Hands Are Stained with Blood. Well, such things are indeed hard to hear, but they are likewise critical to process.